This is Killer Innovations, a show about ideas, creativity, and how you can innovate. Welcome to the Innovator's Garage, where you learn to create your next game-changing killer innovation.
Welcome to this week's Killer Innovations podcast. I'm back here in the studio. I was recently in D.C. meeting with some agencies in the U.S. government. This is all around this big push for innovation that's happening in the U.S. government. Now, these agencies had asked for these meetings for me to come in and discuss how they should think about innovation in their respective areas. It just seems like every agency is under pressure to get some innovations underway, and let me tell you, there is a lot going on. The Beltway Bandits are what we call the Beltway Bandits, and these are all the consultants that are based in Washington, D.C. These bandits are throwing the word innovation around in every one of their proposals in hopes of catching the eye of the person who will award the contract. Now, the politicians are driving this as they have the belief that innovation will solve all of their problems. A better idea, a more creative approach, all the wrongs will be right. Now, as part of my research, I was looking around to see what others had written about this politicization of innovation. And I came across an article in the Forbes of India back in March 16th, which was written by Satyajit. And it's an article where he talks more on the global scale of this politicalization of innovation. Now, he's made some good points, but ones that I don't agree with. One of the points he makes is about the vagueness of these programs or projects. Now, the description of innovation used by most people, not just politicians, is way too vague. They lack the details of what it is you're going to be innovating about. Now, I've shared many times in this show, it's in my book, I teach it in my workshops, the clearer, more defined the focus area, the better the ideas, and ultimately, the better the innovations that will result. Now, this sounds counterintuitive, but the tighter and more crystal clear you are on the focus areas that you want to innovate on, the better the ideas, the quantity of the ideas also increases, but most importantly, the quality of the ideas. And this is where politicians get it wrong. They say, oh, we want to hurry up and we want to innovate around smart cities. Well, that's a pretty broad area. Can you be more specific? Now, I get the feeling that the politicians in this case, are afraid to be too directive in where they specifically need these innovations. They're afraid that by being specific, they're going to miss something. The FOMO, or fear of missing out, is alive and well when it comes to innovation. Now, in the case of governments, or in the case of the work that you're doing with your products, your services, your business, the clear, crisper you can be on those definitions of where to innovate, again, the better the quantity. So, for instance, if you go in and put together your 10 best and brightest people and stick them into a conference room and say, hurry up and come up with a product idea, I'm going to guess that the quantity and the quality of those ideas is going to be lacking. If instead you sat them down and said, we are going to innovate a new product aimed at millennials who are looking for new creative food options, and we want to do this, we want to have it as a mobile platform, what ideas can you come up with? That crisp clearness, you've defined who the target is, you've defined the general area of their interest, you've defined the what, not the how, which is what you should always do when you're defining this focus area. This is where governments fail because they want to get, they almost think that the quantity of the ideas that they can solicit denotes being successful. Versus quantity is good, but you got to have quality ideas to really make that work. And the more vague you are, the weaker the ideas. Now, I can tell you in all of my meetings with the different agencies across the government, every trip I go to Washington, D.C., I get more meetings I need to go to. I'm trying to give them this insight, and it's almost like you're throwing cold water on what their effort is. They know they got to hurry up and get this going. They gotta make something happen. They've got to report up through the hierarchy of the government to show that they're making progress, but they are struggling. And as if you are a regular listener to the show, you've heard me get on my soapbox on this. And that is there are literally hundreds and thousands of innovation consultants out there, most of which have never done innovation. They've never innovated. They've never taken an idea themselves on a blank sheet of paper and taken that through and created a highly successful, serving millions of people types of products and services. And I'm walking around inside of Washington, D.C. and talking to the players that are trying to be engaged in DC around the innovation topic, it's no different. Except now, every Beltway Bandit is hanging out that innovation shingle. So, Satyajit's comments around being vague, right on the money. It's a common problem. It's not limited to one government. This is all politicians, and it's not limited to politicians. It's really universal. The second point was money is not always the answer. Now, many politicians, especially at the state and local level, believe that if they hold yet one more competition with prize money, or they make taxpayer funds available as investments in startup businesses, or they hand out tax credits, that's all they need to do. That's their idea of encouraging an innovation environment, bringing new businesses in, etc. Evidenced a little bit about here what's going on in the United States right now with Amazon trying to select a new location for a second headquarters for Amazon. And every city and every state is falling all over themselves to give away money and tax credits. Now, these are quick hits. They typically can attract a business looking for tax incentives or investments, and it might create some short-term benefits of some new jobs. But what's missing are longer-range thinking. Without that long-range thinking, the only option to grow is more of the same. More monies towards competitions, more tax credits, more incentives, more competitions. Most politicians take this short-term perspective, but once you get on the wheel where that is driving your growth, the only way to drive growth is to continue to do the same. So, for instance, fundamental research, long-range innovation can really only be taken through the support of the government. But instead, funding that used to go to decade or even multi-decade programs is now being moved to short-term programs so that politicians can take credit for the outcome and impact before the next election. Nobody is looking in this long-range innovation. And if you look at some of the things that have had the biggest impacts on our lives, I am a big fan of NASA. I've done a bunch of shows and I've written a bunch of blog posts on this. So you go over and check it out. You can check the blog out at philmckinney.com or the show notes over at killerinnovations.com and just search for NASA, NASA, just search for NASA. And you will find a number of articles and shows that I've done on technologies that have benefited society that was the direct result of NASA, the launching of the Mercury, the Gemini, the Apollo, putting the man on the moon, the space shuttle program, International Space Station. If you look at what things we have in our life today that come from the NASA program, you'd be shocked. Probably the one that we all use is, you stick your finger into a little device when you go into the doctor and it tells you your oxygen level in your blood. That came from NASA. They developed that in order to keep track of the astronauts in space so they could tell if they were getting enough oxygen, etc. And now we get the benefit of that. Every time we go to the doctor, or if you or a loved one has a heart condition, sticking your finger into that device and telling you the blood oxygen level. Those kinds of things sometimes take decades, and there's no immediate financial return. That is the role of governments. Money's not always the answer. Money's necessary, but don't use money to entice quick innovations. Make the long-term bet. If you take a look at the level of funding for long-range research, and I'm just going to take a look at the U.S. spend, because that's the one I am most familiar with. It's been declining for quite some time, and it continues to go down. We are starving long-range innovations in order to get short-term political benefits. The ability to say, I was a politician, and I started this program, and now we've created 500 jobs because we were able to hand out a tax incentive or something. Stop looking at it from the short-term perspective and get back to let's taking advantage of these long-term benefits, because in many cases, only the government can do that. So, we've just covered a couple of the points. We're going to talk about this for the rest of the show, so don't go anywhere. We're talking about political innovations. How should politicians think about innovation? And we're going to be right back after this short break. Welcome back. We're going to continue our conversations on the political innovations. How should politicians think about innovation? One of the challenges that I've seen with my discussions in DC is really this misperception of innovation impact. Politicians hang a lot on innovation in the belief that it's going to solve all the problems. They believe that the innovation is the solution for unemployment, economic disparity, or any other ills their constituents are facing. But let's talk about some statistics. I think this will be a little bit of an eye-opener. And again, I apologize. I'm just talking about the U.S. In the U.S., technology, which is highly attached to politicians' view of innovation, only makes up 10% of the GDP. And I'm going to guess it's the same in other countries around the world. We kind of have this aura around technology, whether it's, the latest phone from Silicon Valley or our online social media or the search engines we use. They must be much bigger, but they're only 10% of the GDP. And what's also really interesting is only 0.5%, listen to this, 0.5% of employees are in industries that did not exist in 2000. So we keep thinking about, it's all this new stuff. That's what's driving all the growth. It's not the case. Only 0.5% of employees in industries that didn't exist in 2000. So that means 99.5% of employees are working in industries that have been around since 2000 and before. Now, it's interesting that, people think, okay, that's an anomaly. We got people scattered all over the United States, etc. Here's the counter statistic to that. Only 1.8% of employees in Silicon Valley work in these new industries. That's right. Only 1.8% of employees, even in Silicon Valley, work in new industries. So we got to be careful of a bias here where we see the press, we hear all the news, we want to rush to be part of the new thing. We think that's where the growth opportunity is. Not the case. And this also gets into the fact that when people think innovation, they sometimes translate it to technology. Innovation applies to all industries, all segments, all jobs, all opportunities. There's nothing that cannot be innovated. For instance, manufacturing comprises 25% of all employment in the U.S., and in other parts of the world, it's actually much larger. Yet we invest little in the form of innovation funding to this sector. Now, there's anomalies to this. Take a look at what Detroit and the state of Michigan is doing to resurrect manufacturing capabilities and manufacturing expertise with the decline of employment from the auto manufacturers. In other countries with higher manufacturing employment, such as China and India, there's also this fear of AI and robotics, which are the results of innovation efforts that will impact their citizens. It's going to impact their jobs. Jobs are going to go away. In some pockets around the world, the politicians have recognized that we're shifting towards this creative economy, and therefore they need to prepare their youth to compete. So there's this fear AI robotics is going to take away all the jobs. There's this shift. There's lots of balls in the air. And yes, it's the right thing for politicians to think about and be aware of, but keep your thinking balanced. Don't become biased and enamored that everything in Silicon Valley is the magic. So here at the Innovators Network, we are starting to work on a new show concept around what we call rural innovation. This is innovation in non-traditional industries in non-traditional locations. We've done one show as kind of a test. I happen to be in the Innovator Studio, which is our 44-foot mobile studio in Paducah, Kentucky, and I interviewed the husband and wife team that are the founders of Finn Gourmet Foods. They're in the fishing industry in this little town of Paducah, right at the meeting point of the Ohio River and the Tennessee River, doing some amazing innovations. And it's not in Silicon Valley, and they're growing, and it's creating jobs. So as politicians need to be thinking beyond just kind of everything Silicon Valley, and I've got to replicate Silicon Valley. That is not the case. Now, this also somewhat extends into another point, which is around innovation and inequality. Many will make the pronouncement that innovation increases inequality, the thinking that new innovations will bypass developing countries and communities. Now, I have a slightly different opinion. Let's take wireless. Now, I've been in this industry since 1984, and 1984 was the start of the wireless industry in Chicago. Now, today, wireless is nearly universally ubiquitous around all the world. It has leveled the playing field pretty much everywhere. Even in Rwanda, where I have investments in entrepreneurs in Africa who are starting businesses and creating jobs there. Now, when we started in Rwanda, particularly where we were at, there was zero broadband. Now, through a friend of mine, Vanu Bose, who's unfortunately recently passed away, Vanu's work in software-defined radio brought broadband to Rwanda, and specifically brought broadband to the fish farms where I'm an investor. But since that time, it has spread quickly. Now, this is an interesting challenge, though, in the fact that, yes, innovation or the future is not universally distributed at the start, but it does spread quickly. Some will raise the role of innovation in future employment, such as I said before, robots and AI will increase unemployment. Go back and look at the headlines in the late 1960s, where it predicted that computers would result in 50% of population being unemployed. Yes, the headline in major newspapers in the United States in the 1960s was telling us that computers were going to put 50% of the people out of work, and that we would have rampant unemployment. Did that happen? No, it never happened. Be careful of building trade barriers to block innovations or to protect innovations. Some people are doing this. They're talking about restricting robots or restricting the AI. Yes, there should be concern about centralization of innovation in the hands of a few companies. We've seen lots of press recently on certain companies being called out because of their dominant power or dominant misuse of their products and services. But innovation is a global phenomena. Go take a look at the inventors on some of the most valuable patents, and just the names will give you evidence of the global nature of these ideas. And this is key. Innovation is global. As I've said many times, innovation's a team sport. It is a global activity. The big multinationals, whether you're talking about IBM, or you're talking about HP, or you're talking about Google, or you're talking about Sony, or you name it, British Telecom, it's a global play. The boundaries of innovation do not stop at the boundaries of countries. Politicians need to be thinking differently, but we do need to talk about innovation and inequality and what role innovation can do to fix that. So don't go anywhere. We're going to continue this conversation. We'll be right back after this quick break. Welcome back to Kill Innovations. We're continuing our conversation around political innovations. How should politicians think about innovation? So we've talked about a number of items. And so in this segment, I want to take a look back and answer the question, so what? Given the challenge we're facing, whether it's economic disparity, I was just reading some articles this morning on the level of homelessness in a number of cities in the U.S., and I've seen it. I just came back from London, and it's universal. Healthcare being a challenge, all the things we're facing. It could get really depressing. We could be in kind of a doom and gloom. The makers should look towards innovation. They should look towards innovators to solve the problems. History says that when you enable and empower and support innovators, we can solve some of our biggest problems. With the polio vaccine, the invention of penicillin, organ transplants, you name it, right? It was from a challenge that innovators were put out there to go solve those problems, and we can solve the major issues. If you look even at what's happening now with the eradication of smallpox and the work towards reduction of malaria in developing countries, if we let the innovators do what they do best, we can solve whatever problems we face. But policymakers need to look at it differently than they have in the past. First up is they need to focus the search for innovations. It's not just about innovation as a term, as a buzzword. You throw it around, you put it on a slide, and you've solved the issues. Innovation only has impact when an idea is translated and made real. They need to focus the search for innovations. They need to do it by defining the area of innovation. Policymakers will generate better ideas that can be actionable to solve the problems if they define the problems. I sometimes get the feeling that politicians don't want to define the problem. They don't want to highlight the problem. But by defining and highlighting the problem, that is when the innovators can do their best work. And one way to drive that I would encourage politicians to think about is crowdsourcing ideas. Now, there's a lot of crowdsourcing platforms out there that deal with innovation. We've talked about a number of them here on the show. I'll put some links up in the show notes if you're interested in looking at those crowdsourcing platforms. But invite others to contribute the ideas. If you have well-defined the area of innovation, we're going to go solve X to this segment of the population to address Y problem, define that, and then open it up to allow people to contribute. Oh yeah, you might do a little award thing, maybe give a little bit of money, maybe you fund a researcher's area of interest as a result of them coming up with a solution to that kind of a problem. But crowdsourcing an idea can really open up and get ideas from areas of the population that you just never would have considered. As I mentioned in the last segment here at the Innovators Network, we are working on identifying and highlighting and giving those innovators who are not in Silicon Valley and who are not in the major hubs some spotlight. Give them a little bit of, give them their 5 minutes of fame. I've just been amazed running in and talking to these people and driving around and seeing what's going on throughout the country. In fact, I'm getting ready to head out here in another 4 days into the Innovator Studio, our mobile studio, to go see and find other innovators who are doing really interesting things that are not in the major hubs. Those are the people we should all tap into to solve our problems, whether it's a business problem or whether it's a societal issue. So again, focus the search and look at crowdsourcing. The third thing that I would encourage politicians to look at is learn to experiment and test. Right? And then as part of that, get comfortable with failure. Politicians do not like failure of any kind. Right? Most CEOs don't like failure of any kind, but politicians especially. Because what happens if there's a failure? If there's a failure, there's, congressional committee meetings up on Capitol Hill. Somebody is brought before the committee and set in front of a table, surrounded by 100 reporters and journalists snapping their pictures. And then, each side of the political party scoring points by seeing who could ask the toughest question or the most embarrassing question. We have to get comfortable with failure. That is one of the things that's unique about Silicon Valley. If you did a startup and you had it fail, it actually, in some cases, gets earned as a badge of honor, and VCs will give you money for your next idea. Why? Because they know that the heartache of losing an idea, having a company not work, you will do everything in your power to never have that experience again. And so think about that from the standpoint of politicians. We have to get comfortable with letting people try, experiment, have failures, and don't expect a big bang, right? You can't hit grand slam home runs all the time. A couple of singles, a couple doubles, a couple triples, all will get you and eventually allow you to put points up on the scoreboard. Another area is do not ignore the long-range research. We need more funding, and all governments should be looking towards long-range research. That's what leads to the innovations that we enjoy today. Now, had a politician been looking to get reelected back when we did the investment in the internet was a multi-decade investment. If a politician today was back then looking to make that kind of a bet, do you think it would have gotten funded? No, because they wouldn't have gotten credit for it. It wouldn't have helped them get reelected, right? We need this long-range research. We need that research that will lead to the innovations that our kids and our grandkids. It's the destiny we leave. The innovations we do today and the research we fund today may not change our lives, but it's going to change the lives of our children, and it'll change the lives of our grandchildren. So again, the advice that I would give to a politician: 1, focus the search for innovations. Define the problem space. The better you can describe it, the better you can create the BHAG, the bold, hairy, audacious goal. That is the rallying cry for innovators. We need another John F. Kennedy kind of BHAG, where his BHAG was to put the man on the moon. What is our BHAG today to solve the challenges we are facing today? 2, don't be afraid of crowdsourcing ideas. Just don't think that people have to have a PhD or live in Silicon Valley and those are the only ones you should be listening to. We have great innovators around the world who can contribute those ideas. Learn to experiment and test. Do not be afraid of failure, and don't expect the big bang. And then lastly, again, is look at investing that for those long-range innovations, that long-range research. That investment we make today in those long-range research programs will benefit our kids and our grandkids. And sad to say, we are letting our innovation funnel dry up, and our kids and grandkids will suffer as a result. Love to hear your thoughts, whether you agree or disagree around this concept of how should politicians think about innovation. Post your comments and feedback and your ideas over at the show notes over at killinnovations.com. Don't go anywhere. We've got the next segment come up next week, or next up is this week's 5 minutes to new ideas. It's a new segment we've designed for the creative mind, looking for that spark that could result in a game-changing innovation. Now, we've been running this multiple weeks, and we're now actually getting ready to prepare the launch of it as a standalone show. So, as I jokingly told the team here at the Innovators Network, some of our listeners, I'm going to guess, probably would benefit from just being able to have to listen to 5 minutes versus the 45 minutes of the normal show. So, if you have that short attention span, or if you want to use this as a stimulating kind of thing that you could just randomly listen to 5 minutes and see what it sparks an idea for you or your team, we're going to package these up. We're going to put them out as an entirely new show. So stay tuned. Stay glued in on the social media. We'll be posting the announcement of when the show is actually going to go live there. And each of this would be the 5-minute segments at the end of this show. So don't go anywhere. You're going to get to listen to it now before it's a standalone show. This week's 5 minutes to new ideas. Get ready to be challenged right after this quick commercial break. This segment of the show is what I call 5 minutes to new ideas, designed for the creative mind looking for that next great idea. Each episode will challenge you to think differently about yourself, your business, and your product and services by asking unique, funny, and sometimes crazy questions. These questions are designed to force you to look beyond the obvious and to uncover ideas and opportunities you never before considered. So get out your notebook and be ready to uncover that game-changing idea. Here is 5 minutes to new ideas. We tend to assume that any customer is a good customer. However, if you find that you're working like crazy, have a solid and reliable customer base, but you're still not making the profits you expected, then you need to ask the question, who do I not want to use my product? Do you remember back when dial-up internet services first started to transition to the mainstream? All the way back, yes, in the early 90s, companies like AOL, CompuServe, The Source, Earthlink all began offering access to the web that was billed, yes, by the minute. The more you used, the more you paid. Logical, right? These three companies essentially offer the same product on the same terms. Very quickly, the people who used the services they offered divided into two camps. The majority logged on once or twice a day, they checked their email, read some sports stats, caught up on a little gossip, and then quickly logged off. However, a small minority logged on for hours or even days at a time. These people quickly ran up bills into the thousands. Now, pop quiz, is this a good thing or a bad thing for your business? These high-volume users love your service, but paradoxically, their passion for what you offer will almost inevitably force them to stop or drive them into an untenable situation if they try to continue. So, if you were running AOL, CompuServe, The Source, Earthlink, what would you have done? Continue the same pricing structure that strongly disfavored your most ardent users? Or figure out some way to continue improving profits without punishing the people who really, really love what you do? In other words, would you decide to keep or push out these high-use customers? In the end, AOL was the first to take a radical step to address these questions. In 1996, they switched from a pay-per-minute system to a flat-rate fee. Now, this was daring and audacious move because they risked seriously alienating low-usage customers who were used to paying less than $20 a month. On the flip side, they had to massively upgrade their infrastructure in order to accommodate the demand. AOL was bombarded with complaints about busy signals and slow speed. Users joked that AOL stood for always offline. For a short while, it looked like they might have a poor decision, that they should go back and rethink that. However, this new flat rate fee addressed a fundamental fear that even low usage customers had with the old pricing formula. Namely, not knowing how much that monthly cost was going to be. AOL's new strategy took away that stress that came with worrying about the bill. Parents no longer had to hover over their kids and nag them about getting offline. The result was that the company shot ahead of all the others and became the leading ISP through to the early 2000s. The other companies, Earthlink, CompuServe, The Source, Prodigy, quickly copied AOL's new pricing structure. But AOL had that huge advantage of being the first mover. Their competitors looked like copiers, where AOL looked like a game changer. They won that round. In the early days of the mobile industry, telecom companies grappled with similar issues with their cell phone customers, hogging the bandwidth in a given area. Parents would toss a cell phone into their baby's crib, dial another cell phone from it, and keep the line open all night, using it as a baby monitor under the free evenings and weekends pricing promotions that were quite popular in the early days of mobile. More recently, people have used their smartphones as jerry-rigged security systems by streaming constant live footage from their office or home security cameras while they are on vacation. Anyone who's experienced problems with AT&T's network or Verizon in urban areas can understand why this might be an issue. So, are these customers abusive? Do you want them? Should you even think about penalizing them for using vastly more than their share of the network and compromising the connectivity of other users? If I were still working in the wireless industry, I'd be looking at ways to understand and migrate the high volume users into an elite program. My feeling is that if someone loves what you do and uses it habitually, then that's a customer you want to hold on to. If what you see as abuse is actually foresight, being ahead of that curve, then you might be looking at a future revenue stream rather than a problem. You just haven't figured out how to separate out their use, given its own program apart from the existing customer agreement, and then how to monetize it. In this situation, it's worth taking the time to figure out a way to find a satisfactory medium between their needs and yours. So ask yourself, who do I not want to use my product now, but may want to in the future? And don't stop at the obvious answer. I'm Phil McKinney, and thanks for listening. Thanks for taking the time out of your busy schedule to join in. If you have any comments or suggestions, drop me a note over at phil@killerinnovations.com. Now, the reason I've been doing this show since 2005 is to pay back my early mentor by paying it forward. My first mentor, Bob Davis, invested an immense amount of time in training and coaching me, which had a major impact on my career. When I went back and asked him how I could pay him back, he just laughed and said I couldn't. I had to pay it forward. If I could ask for a favor, could you help me pay it forward? How? 1, give us a rating wherever you get your podcasts, as that helps spread the word. And 2, by telling others about the show. This episode of Killer Innovations was produced by the Innovators Network. You can find the show notes and the entire show catalog over at killerinnovations.com. I'll talk to you next week. In the meantime, go out and change the world with your killer innovation. Bye-bye.